Introduction: The Dream of Empire. They say some people are born beneath stars that burn brighter than others, but what if a man's fire burns so fiercely that it refuses to die even after thousands of years? Long before empires turned to dust and the statues of conquerors faded under the weight of time, there was a boy who looked upon the horizon and decided it wasn't enough. He didn't just dream of kingdoms, he dreamed of eternity. His name was Alexander, and his story is not merely about conquest, but about the unbearable hunger to touch the divine. It is a obsession, brilliance, and the fragile line that separates greatness from madness. In the rugged land of ancient Macedonia, a kingdom overshadowed by the power of Athens and the prestige of Persia, a prince was born in 356 BC in the city of Pella. The air itself seemed to tremble with prophecy. His father, King Philip II, was a man of ruthless ambition and unmatched military genius, whose reforms had turned Macedonia from a scattered realm of hill tribes into a disciplined war machine. His mother, Olympias, was a woman of fiery temperament and mystical devotion. She was said to walk barefoot through sacred rituals, speaking to snakes and whispering to gods. From her, Alexander inherited not just intensity, but the dangerous belief that he was chosen by the divine. According to legend, on the night of his birth, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, a sign, so the soothsayers claimed, that a force had entered the world capable of changing it forever. From his earliest days, Alexander was raised in a world where war was as natural as breath and ambition was the only currency that mattered. Philip's court was a place of generals, philosophers, and schemers, where alliances shifted like the wind and greatness was measured not in words, but in victories. The young prince grew up watching his father reshape the Greek world through both brilliance and brutality. Yet even as a child, Alexander's pride set him apart. When a messenger once brought news that Philip had conquered a new city, Alexander, still a boy, muttered, "He'll leave nothing for me to conquer." It was not arrogance, it was a prophecy of what was to come. Philip recognized his son's potential early, but he also knew that genius without guidance was as dangerous as a sword in untrained hands. So he sought the finest mind in Greece to shape Alexander's, Aristotle. The philosopher came to Pella to educate the young prince in philosophy, science, ethics, and the art of reason. Under his tutelage, Alexander learned not just logic, but the idea that the world was a vast tapestry of causes and consequences, that knowledge was as powerful as the sword. Yet while Aristotle taught him the beauty of wisdom, it was Homer's Iliad that captured Alexander's soul. He slept with a copy of it beneath his pillow, seeing in Achilles not just a hero, but a mirror of his own restless spirit. Achilles had fought for glory eternal, not gold or peace, and Alexander, even as a teenager, decided that he would do the same. But even brilliance cannot exist in peace for long. The bond between father and son, though bound by blood and ambition, was never simple. Philip was a conqueror, but he was also a pragmatist. He believed in patience, alliances, and the slow accumulation of power. Alexander, in contrast, burned with impatience. He wanted glory now, not later. Their relationship was a collision of two storms, one calculating and grounded, the other explosive and untamed. Rumors spread through the Macedonian court that Olympias encouraged her son to see himself as divine, perhaps even a child of Zeus himself. Whether this was a mother's flattery or madness, no one could say. But the boy believed it. And that belief would one day move armies and topple kings. As Macedonia expanded under Philip's military genius, uniting the fractured Greek city-states under his banner, the world itself seemed to shrink before his ambition. But fate, as always, had its own plans. For in the shadow of Philip's glory, Alexander was growing, observing, learning, waiting. He watched his father's victories not with envy, but with the impatience of someone certain that he could do more. And he would. Because while Philip dreamed of conquering Greece, Alexander dreamed of conquering the world. Part 1: The Birth of a Legend. They say greatness isn't born, it's forged. But sometimes, the world witnesses an exception. In 356 BC, in the northern Greek kingdom of Macedonia, beneath a sky torn by lightning and fire, a child was born who would one day make the entire known world tremble at his name. That child was Alexander. And from the very beginning, the signs whispered that he was not meant to live an ordinary life. According to legend, the very night he came into the world, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The priests said the goddess herself had left her sanctuary to witness the birth of someone destined to change the course of history. To some, it was coincidence. To others, prophecy. Alexander's father was King Philip II, a warrior and statesman whose brilliance had transformed Macedonia from a backward, divided land into a rising superpower. His mother, Olympias, was a princess from Epirus, fierce, passionate, and deeply spiritual. She was said to be part of the mysterious cult of Dionysus, walking barefoot in moonlit rituals, her hair crowned with serpents. Philip was a man of ambition, Olympias, a woman of fire. Together, they created a storm, and Alexander was its lightning. From the earliest days of his childhood, the young prince was told he was special. His mother whispered that Zeus himself was his true father, and the boy grew up believing that divine blood flowed through his veins. Whether this was truth or delusion mattered little, what mattered was that Alexander believed it. That belief would give him a confidence so unshakable, a drive so relentless, that no obstacle, not even the Persian Empire, could break it. But life in the Macedonian court was no cradle of comfort. Philip ruled a kingdom built on war. His court was a place of generals, schemers, and mercenaries, men who respected only strength. The young Alexander learned early that to survive, one had to command respect, not simply inherit it. From the training grounds of Pella, where boys wrestled and hunted, to the marble halls where politics were played like chess, Alexander absorbed every lesson, every strategy, every whisper of power. Even as a child, he refused to be overshadowed. When a messenger once brought word that Philip had captured another great city, Alexander's reaction was sharp: "My father will conquer everything before I have the chance to prove myself." It wasn't jealousy, it was destiny calling. Philip saw both the brilliance and the danger in his son. To channel that restless mind, he sought a teacher who could tame his spirit without breaking it. That teacher was Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of Greece. In a quiet sanctuary near Mysa, surrounded by gardens and the scent of olive trees, Alexander and a small circle of noble youths studied under him. Aristotle taught them philosophy, science, medicine, and politics, but more than that, he taught them how to think. He showed Alexander that the world was vast, complex, and interconnected. That reason and knowledge were as powerful as the sword. Yet even Aristotle's wisdom couldn't completely tame the young prince's fiery ambition. While the philosopher spoke of balance and virtue, Alexander's heart belonged to heroes. He carried with him a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, and he slept with it beneath his pillow. Achilles, the greatest of all warriors, became his idol. Alexander didn't just read the tales of Troy, he lived them in his mind, believing that he, too, was destined to achieve immortal glory. As he grew into adolescence, Alexander's brilliance began to shine in ways that startled even his father. He displayed a rare blend of courage and intellect, daring and discipline. Once, when a magnificent but wild horse named Bucephalus was brought before Philip, no one could tame it. The animal reared and screamed, throwing off every rider who dared approach. The courtiers laughed, until the young Alexander stepped forward. He noticed something others hadn't: the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Turning Bucephalus toward the sun so the shadow fell behind them, Alexander mounted the beast with calm confidence, whispering softly, guiding it with patience instead of force. Within moments, the untamable horse obeyed him completely. The court fell silent. Philip, his pride momentarily overtaken by awe, declared, "My son, you must seek a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." That moment became legend, not because of the horse, but because it revealed who Alexander truly was. He didn't conquer through brute strength alone, he conquered through perception, understanding, and unshakable will. He saw what others missed. And that vision would one day carry him farther than any man before him. Yet for all his growing fame, Alexander's relationship with his father grew strained. Philip was a man of political genius, but his ambitions often came at the cost of loyalty. As he remarried and fathered new heirs, Olympius was cast aside, and Alexander's position at court grew uncertain. Rumors and plots filled the palace halls. Whispers of betrayal spread between mother and son. Olympius, ever proud and vengeful, filled Alexander's mind with visions of destiny and injustice. And as Philip prepared for his greatest campaign, an invasion of Persia, a sense of unease settled over the royal family. Macedon was united, the Greek city-states had been subdued, and a new empire lay waiting across the sea. But before Philip could begin his conquest, fate intervened. In 336 BC, during the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra, Philip II walked into the theater of Aegae surrounded by nobles, guards, and allies. It was meant to be a day of celebration, but it ended in blood. As the king entered, one of his bodyguards rushed forward and plunged a dagger into his chest. Philip fell dead before the crowd, and chaos erupted. The assassin was killed on the spot, but questions would haunt Macedonia forever. Was it revenge? A conspiracy? Or something darker, perhaps even orchestrated by Olympias herself? Whatever the truth, the throne of Macedonia passed instantly to 20-year-old Alexander. In a single, violent moment, the student of Aristotle became the ruler of an empire. Surrounded by enemies, doubted by allies, and haunted by his father's legacy, Alexander stood before his people with the fire of destiny in his eyes. The boy who once dreamed of Achilles now had his own Troy to conquer. And from that day onward, the world would remember him not as a prince, but as a force of nature. Part 2: The Rise of the Conqueror. The death of King Philip II sent shockwaves across the ancient world. For all his flaws, Philip had been a man of vision, a unifier who brought Macedonia from obscurity to dominance over Greece. His assassination created a dangerous vacuum, one filled with suspicion, ambition, and fear. In that moment of chaos, few believed that his 20-year-old son could control a kingdom filled with seasoned generals, bitter rivals, and restive Greek states waiting for the chance to break free. But those who underestimated Alexander were about to discover the truth, that the boy king possessed not just courage, but a mind as sharp as any blade forged in Macedonian fire. From the moment he took the throne, Alexander faced threats on all sides. Inside Macedonia, rival factions whispered that he was too young to rule, that he had only inherited his father's throne by accident of blood. In Greece, cities like Athens and Thebes began plotting rebellion, hoping to reclaim their freedom from Macedonian rule. Beyond the borders, northern tribes stirred, sensing weakness in the south. And to make matters worse, even within his own court, loyalties were uncertain. Many of his father's generals had served Philip for decades, men of ambition and pride, who saw the young king as an untested boy surrounded by his mother's influence and dangerous ideas of divine destiny. Yet Alexander's response was swift, cold, and calculated. Within days of his father's funeral, he moved decisively to eliminate every threat to his throne. Those suspected of involvement in Philip's murder were executed or exiled. He reaffirmed his claim to the kingship through ceremony and steel alike, and one by one, he demanded the allegiance of every Macedonian noble. His charisma and confidence won over many, his ruthlessness silenced the rest. In a display of both political genius and military prowess, Alexander secured the loyalty of the powerful army his father had built, the formidable Macedonian phalanx, whose discipline and unity had already transformed the art of war. But it wasn't enough to rule Macedonia. Alexander knew his father's empire could crumble if Greece sensed any weakness. So before the year was over, he marched south. The Greek city-states, always proud and restless, had begun to believe that Macedonian dominance might die with Philip. Thebes, in particular, rose in rebellion, declaring independence and preparing to fight. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Greek world might shake off Macedonian control. But then Alexander appeared, not as a hesitant successor, but as a storm. He marched his army across hundreds of miles with relentless speed, arriving before Thebes even knew he had left Macedonia. The sheer swiftness of his approach stunned both enemies and allies alike. When the Thebans saw the young king standing before their walls with 30,000 soldiers, they hesitated. Some still remembered his father's strength, others saw only a boy. But Alexander gave them one chance: surrender and live. The Thebans refused. What followed was a brutal lesson that the world would not forget. The siege of Thebes was short and devastating. Alexander's army breached the city walls with calculated fury, slaughtering the defenders and burning much of the city to the ground. 6,000 Thebans were killed, thousands more sold into slavery, and the once proud city was wiped from the map. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, out of Alexander's respect for Greek culture. The message was unmistakable: rebellion against Macedonia meant annihilation. When news of Thebes' destruction spread across Greece, fear followed. Athens, shaken and uncertain, chose to submit rather than face the same fate. The Greek League, which Philip had created, reaffirmed its loyalty under Alexander's leadership. In the space of a single year, the young king had crushed his enemies, united Greece, and secured his power. And yet, in his mind, this was only the beginning. His father's dream, to cross into Asia and conquer the mighty Persian Empire, was now his to fulfill. But Alexander's ambition went far beyond his father's. Where Philip saw expansion, Alexander saw immortality. The Persian Empire was the largest in the world, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India, governed by the so-called King of Kings, Darius III. To most, Persia was an unconquerable giant, rich, ancient, and overwhelming. But Alexander, in his boundless confidence, saw it as a challenge worthy of his destiny. He believed the gods had chosen him to bring order to the world, to unite East and West under a single vision of greatness. Before he set out on this monumental campaign, however, he made sure that Macedonia would remain stable in his absence. He appointed trusted generals and governors to maintain order, securing the loyalty of his homeland through a delicate balance of reward and fear. Then, in the spring of 334 BC, he gathered his army, about 35,000 men, a force small compared to Persia's vast legions but disciplined and devoted beyond measure. Among them were the hardened veterans of his father's wars, the elite companion cavalry, and the indomitable Macedonian phalanx, each soldier carrying a sarissa, a long spear that had become the symbol of Macedonian dominance. As Alexander prepared to cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divided Europe and Asia, he paused at the ancient site of Troy. Standing before the ruins of the city where Achilles had fought and died, he offered sacrifices to the gods and honored the memory of his hero. In that moment, legend and reality intertwined. He believed himself to be walking in the footsteps of the mythic warriors of old, not merely as their descendant, but as their successor. Taking up his shield, he declared that he would surpass them all, that where Achilles won glory on the plains of Troy, Alexander would win glory across the world. Crossing into Asia was more than a military maneuver, it was a symbolic act of destiny. The historian Arrian later wrote that Alexander threw a spear into the soil of Asia as he landed, claiming the continent as his own by right of conquest. To his men, it was a moment of pride and anticipation; to Alexander, it was the beginning of immortality. Every step he took from that moment onward was guided by a singular purpose: to become not just the ruler of an empire, but the embodiment of greatness itself. The first test of that purpose came almost immediately, on the banks of the river Granicus. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, underestimating the young Macedonian, had gathered a large force to stop his advance. The Persians believed that their numbers and cavalry would easily crush Alexander's smaller army. But they did not yet understand the nature of their enemy. As his men prepared to cross the river, his generals hesitated, warning that the current was too strong and the Persian positions too high. Alexander's response was typical, bold, almost reckless. Without waiting, he led the charge himself, riding directly into the torrent, his silver-plumed helmet glinting in the sun. His cavalry followed, clashing with the Persians in a chaotic and brutal battle. The fighting was fierce, but the discipline of the Macedonians and the courage of their king turned the tide. Alexander personally struck down several enemy commanders, his presence electrifying his troops and terrifying his foes. By the end of the day, the Persians were broken, their forces scattered, and Asia Minor lay open before him. In his first major battle against the greatest empire on earth, the 22-year-old conqueror had triumphed. The victory at Granicus was more than just a military success, it was a statement. The young king of Macedonia had crossed into Asia, faced the Persian army, and emerged victorious. The legend of Alexander the Great had begun. As the sun set over the river, his soldiers cheered his name, and Alexander looked eastward, toward the endless lands that awaited him. For the first time, he saw the shape of his destiny stretching beyond the horizon, a destiny not merely to conquer, but to be remembered as the man who changed the world. And so, with his armor stained by battle and his mind set on eternity, Alexander marched deeper into Asia, his army at his back and the fate of empires before him. Part 3: The March of Destiny. As the dust of the Granicus settled and the wounded were carried from the blood-soaked banks, Alexander stood before his men with the calm assurance of a king who had just rewritten fate. The victory had been swift and total. The Persians, who once seemed like gods ruling from golden palaces, now appeared mortal, fallible, vulnerable, and unprepared for the storm that had crossed from the west. For the Macedonians, the triumph was intoxicating. They had followed their young king into Asia, uncertain and wary, but now they saw that he was not only Philip's son, he was something greater. To them, Alexander seemed touched by the divine, guided by the same gods who had once favored Achilles and Heracles. Yet for Alexander himself, the victory at Granicus was not an end, but a beginning. It was proof that the world could indeed be bent to his will. In the aftermath, he showed the same blend of ruthlessness and generosity that would define his conquests. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were treated harshly, many executed as traitors, while the captured Persian nobles were treated with dignity. This was a deliberate gesture, both mercy and message. Alexander wanted the people of Asia to see him not as a barbarian invader, but as a liberator, a rightful heir to the world's greatest empire. He presented himself as the avenger of Greece, punishing Persia for its ancient crimes during the Greco-Persian Wars, yet at the same time, he adopted elements of Persian ceremony and diplomacy, subtly weaving himself into their world. From the river, he marched his army south through Asia Minor, liberating city after city. In each place, he was met with a mix of resistance and reverence. Some Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for generations opened their gates to him with joy, welcoming the chance to reclaim their freedom under Macedonian protection. Others resisted and were crushed without mercy. Alexander's approach was always the same, swift, decisive, and theatrical. His victories were not only strategic, they were psychological. He understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as the sword. At Sardis, the Persian capital of Lydia, he received the city's surrender without a fight. The Persian governor, realizing resistance was futile, handed over the citadel keys and acknowledged Alexander as master of the region. This pattern repeated across the coast, the fall of Ephesus, the submission of Miletus, and the long, brutal siege of Halicarnassus. The city, defended by a Persian commander named Memnon of Rhodes, a brilliant mercenary and one of the few who understood Alexander's genius, held out fiercely. Memnon knew that the best way to defeat Alexander was not through direct confrontation, but through attrition, by cutting off his supply lines and forcing him into exhaustion. For months, Alexander threw his army against the city's massive walls, enduring fire, ambushes, and counterattacks. In the end, Halicarnassus burned, and though Memnon escaped, his resistance had shown Alexander that conquest would not always be swift or glorious. Yet for all the hardship, the campaign deepened the bond between the king and his men. They had seen him fight alongside them, share their food, and march at their pace. Alexander's charisma was magnetic, he remembered names, rewarded bravery, and spoke to his soldiers as brothers in destiny rather than mere followers. To the Macedonians, their king was no longer just a ruler. He was the embodiment of their collective ambition. And as stories of his courage spread, so too did his legend. By 333 BC, Alexander had secured most of Asia Minor. The coastal cities were under his control, and his rear was secure. But ahead lay the true test, the Persian king himself, Darius III. Unlike the satraps and regional commanders Alexander had faced before, Darius ruled over millions. His empire stretched across 3 continents, his armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. For Darius, the idea of a young Macedonian upstart threatening the heart of Persia was an insult that demanded retribution. He began gathering a massive army, determined to crush Alexander before he could march deeper into Asia. The confrontation came near the small town of Issus, along the northeastern coast of the Mediterranean. It was here, between mountains and sea, that the two greatest armies of their age collided. Alexander commanded roughly 40,000 men, while Darius's forces may have exceeded 100,000. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by terrain that nullified some of Persia's numerical advantage. As Darius's chariots and infantry lined up across the plain, the great king himself sat atop a golden chariot surrounded by nobles and guards, confident that this day would end the Macedonian threat forever. But Alexander had other plans. He studied the ground, read the enemy's movements, and adjusted his formations with precision born of instinct and intellect. His companion cavalry formed a wedge on the right flank, while the phalanx held firm in the center, their long spears bristling like a wall of iron. As the Persians advanced, the Macedonians absorbed the shock, their lines bending but not breaking. Then, at the perfect moment, Alexander struck. Leading the cavalry himself, he charged toward Darius's position, cutting through the Persian ranks like lightning. His target was not victory by numbers, it was the king himself. The battle descended into chaos. Dust filled the air, the clash of bronze and steel echoing through the narrow plain. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, thundered forward, the young king at its back shouting commands above the din. The Persian lines wavered as their center began to collapse. And then came the moment that would be told and retold for centuries. Darius, seeing Alexander bearing down upon him, turned his chariot and fled. The sight of the great king retreating shattered Persian morale. Panic rippled through the ranks, and the once mighty army broke apart. When the dust settled, tens of thousands of Persians lay dead or captured. The royal family of Darius, his wife, mother, and children, fell into Alexander's hands. And yet, in one of the most striking moments of his life, Alexander treated them not as prisoners but as honored guests. He assured them of their safety and dignity, even bowing to Darius's mother in respect. To his enemies, this act seemed like magnanimity; to his followers, it was political brilliance. By behaving like a true monarch, merciful yet unyielding, Alexander was already beginning to present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a world ruler, one destined to inherit Persia's throne. The victory at Issus shook the ancient world. The once invincible Persian Empire had been humiliated, its king fleeing before the son of Philip. Across Asia, satraps and governors began to waver in their loyalty, some submitting to Alexander without a fight. In Greece, his legend grew to divine proportions. Poets compared him to Achilles, philosophers debated whether he had surpassed even Heracles in valor. But while the world marveled at his triumphs, Alexander's mind was already turning eastward. Darius had escaped, and as long as he lived, the empire was not yet his. Yet before he could chase the great king into the heart of Persia, Alexander needed control of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Phoenician cities, with their powerful fleets, were vital for securing supply lines and preventing Persian counterattacks. Most surrendered willingly, but one city refused, Tyre. The island fortress stood defiant, surrounded by walls that rose more than 100 feet above the sea. It was said to be unconquerable, and its people mocked Alexander from their ramparts. The siege of Tyre would become one of the most remarkable military feats in ancient history. For 7 months, Alexander's engineers labored to build a massive causeway connecting the mainland to the island, all while under constant attack from Tyrian ships and archers. The Macedonians constructed siege towers taller than the city walls and brought battering rams across the sea. When the final assault came, it was apocalyptic. Macedonian soldiers stormed the walls, fire consumed the harbor, and the once proud city fell in blood and ruin. Alexander ordered thousands executed and the rest sold into slavery. It was a grim reminder that resistance to him carried a terrible price. With Tyre's destruction, the entire eastern Mediterranean coast was now his. One by one, cities opened their gates, and the great Persian fleet, cut off from its bases, crumbled without a fight. From the Aegean to the borders of Egypt, Alexander was master. Yet, even as his empire expanded, his ambition burned hotter. Each victory only fed the hunger for more. To his men, he was a living god; to his enemies, an unstoppable force. And somewhere deep within himself, Alexander began to believe that the line between man and divinity was one he might yet cross. The road ahead led into Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs and gods, where destiny awaited him beneath the desert sun. Part 4: The Son of Zeus. By the time Alexander turned his gaze toward Egypt, the ancient world had already begun to reshape itself around his shadow. The defeat of Darius at Issus had sent tremors through the Persian Empire, and as Alexander's armies swept down the coast, the cities that once swore loyalty to Persia now bent the knee to him. Each conquest came faster, each surrender more eager. Yet Egypt was different. It was not merely a province, it was a civilization older than Greece itself, a kingdom of gods, pharaohs, and mysteries buried beneath the sands. To the Persians, Egypt had always been a jewel in the crown of empire, but one often restless under foreign rule. And as Alexander crossed into its deserts, the Egyptians saw in him not another oppressor, but perhaps a liberator sent by the gods themselves. When his army approached the Nile Delta in 332 BC, there was no battle. The Persian satrap Mazax, recognizing the futility of resistance, offered no fight. Egypt, weary of Persian control, opened its arms to the young conqueror. For the first time since crossing into Asia, Alexander entered a land that welcomed him not as a destroyer, but as a deliverer. His arrival was celebrated with offerings and ceremony, and the priests of Heliopolis declared that the gods had chosen him to rule. In a land where divine kingship had been the foundation of power for millennia, Alexander understood the significance of their acceptance. He was not simply a king among men anymore, he was being spoken of as a son of the gods. As he moved through Egypt, Alexander's demeanor changed. He still led his army with the same discipline and fire, but now there was something more deliberate in his gestures, something ceremonial in his manner. He wore not just the armor of a warrior but the robes of a pharaoh. To the Egyptians, this was natural; every ruler who sat upon the throne of Egypt was divine by right. But to Alexander's Greek followers, it was startling. They had grown up in a world where kings were mortal men, bound by reason and honor. Yet Alexander's belief in his destiny had always stretched beyond mortal boundaries, and Egypt would only feed that fire. It was here, on the western edge of the Nile, that Alexander made one of the most enduring decisions of his life. Standing on the coast where the blue of the sea met the golden expanse of desert, he envisioned a city, a new kind of city, that would outlast empires. Guided, he claimed, by divine inspiration, he traced its boundaries in the sand with the shaft of his spear. This city would be called Alexandria. It would be a place where Greek reason and Egyptian mysticism would meet, a bridge between worlds. Scholars, merchants, and philosophers would one day call it home. For Alexander, it was more than a strategic seaport, it was a monument to his own vision, a symbol of civilization's fusion under one rule. But even as he planned for the future, something deeper was stirring within him, something that had nothing to do with strategy or empire. In the Egyptian mind, every great ruler needed divine affirmation. And Alexander, raised by a mother who had always told him he was destined for greatness, longed for a sign that his path was ordained by the gods. That sign, he believed, lay far to the west, deep within the burning sands of the Libyan desert, at a place known as Siwa. There, in a secluded oasis, stood the oracle of Zeus Ammon, one of the most sacred shrines of the ancient world. The priests there claimed to speak the will of the god himself, a deity worshipped both as Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, and as Ammon, the ram-headed god of creation and kingship in Egyptian belief. It was a perilous journey. The desert offered no mercy, its dunes stretched endlessly beneath a pitiless sun, and the wind carried both heat and silence. Many warned Alexander against it, but he was undeterred. To him, the pilgrimage was not a test of endurance, it was a test of destiny. With a small escort, he rode into the desert, guided only by the stars and the faith that the gods would not abandon their chosen son. Legend would later say that when his men were lost and the path uncertain, two serpents appeared, leading them to the oasis. Others claimed that Zeus himself sent rain to quench their thirst. Whatever truth lies buried beneath the myth, Alexander reached Siwa alive. There, before the high priests of the oracle, the conqueror entered alone into the sacred chamber. What passed within those walls has been lost to time. The priests spoke to him in whispers, and when he emerged, he did not reveal what they had said. But from that day forward, Alexander carried himself with a new certainty, a calmness that bordered on divinity. His closest companions later recalled that when asked what the oracle had told him, Alexander simply smiled and said, "I have heard the words of the god." Yet rumors spread quickly, that the oracle had declared him not merely a king, but the son of Zeus Ammon himself. To some, this revelation was blasphemy. To others, it was destiny confirmed. But to Alexander, it was truth. He no longer saw his ambition as human, he believed it was divine will made flesh. His conquests were not acts of empire, they were acts of cosmic order. The gods, he believed, had placed him on earth to unite mankind under one rule, one vision, one destiny. It was a belief that would elevate him to greatness, and drive him toward madness. When he returned from Siwa, the transformation was visible to all. He had left Macedonia as a prince, conquered Asia as a king, and now he carried himself as something greater. The priests of Egypt crowned him pharaoh, declaring him the living son of Ammonius Ra, the sun god. He accepted the title with reverence, performing the ancient rituals, and the people hailed him as divine. To the Egyptians, this was as it should be; to Alexander, it was confirmation that the heavens themselves had chosen him. But beneath the ceremonies and divine proclamations, Alexander never forgot his mission. Persia still stood, and Darius still lived. Egypt, for all its beauty and reverence, was a chapter, not the end. As his army rested by the Nile, he began preparing for the next stage of the campaign, the march eastward, through the heart of Mesopotamia, toward Babylon, and the final confrontation with the Persian king. Yet something had changed in the young conqueror. The Alexander who left Egypt was not the same man who had entered it. He now carried the weight of immortality upon his shoulders, a conviction that his life was guided by divine purpose. His men adored him, but they also began to fear the growing distance between them. The boy who once laughed and drank among his companions now stood apart, touched by something none of them could fully understand. When he finally gave the order to march, the desert winds carried with them the echo of prophecy: the son of Zeus Ammon was going to war. Ahead lay the vast plains of Gaugamela, where the fate of the ancient world would be decided. And behind him, in the sands of Egypt, the legend of Alexander the God-King was born. Part 5: The Battle That Shook the World. By the time Alexander left Egypt in 331 BC, his legend had already begun to outgrow his mortal form. He was no longer just a Macedonian king on a campaign, he was a symbol, to his men, to his enemies, and to himself. His journey through the desert to the oracle of Zeus Ammon had changed him. Those who marched behind him could feel it. He carried himself with a sense of calm authority, as though the gods had whispered a secret to him that no one else could comprehend. Yet even as he moved with divine conviction, he remained a soldier at heart, calculating, disciplined, and endlessly determined. His next move was toward destiny itself. The time had come to destroy Persia completely. As Alexander's army advanced eastward, they crossed the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia, the land that had been the beating heart of ancient empires for thousands of years. The terrain was harsh and endless, a vast expanse of open plains, the kind of land where the outcome of a battle could shift with a single charge. Word spread quickly through the Persian Empire that Alexander was coming, and Darius, the great king, knew he could not run any longer. The defeat at Issus had scarred his pride, now he needed redemption. He summoned every available soldier from across his realm: Medes, Bactrians, Scythians, Armenians, even Indian war elephants. Some accounts claim his forces numbered over 200,000 men. Whether true or not, what mattered was the scale of what was coming. It would not be a skirmish. It would be the end of an age. Alexander knew that Darius would choose his ground carefully, and indeed, the great king selected the plains near a small village called Gaugamela. The terrain was wide and flat, ideal for the Persian cavalry and chariots to maneuver freely. Darius even ordered the land cleared of stones and leveled, ensuring that his war chariots could move without obstruction. This wasn't just a battlefield, it was a stage upon which the fate of the world would be decided. In early October, the two armies finally faced each other. On one side stood the might of Persia, stretching as far as the eye could see, banners fluttering, chariots gleaming under the sun, elephants towering in the distance. On the other side stood Alexander's disciplined Macedonian phalanx, his cavalry poised like a drawn bowstring, his soldiers veterans of countless battles. The Persians outnumbered them by a staggering margin, but Alexander's men had something the Persians lacked: absolute faith in their commander. The night before the battle, Darius's camp blazed with torches, a spectacle of noise, music, and restless movement. Alexander's camp, by contrast, was silent. His men slept deeply, confident that their king knew what awaited them. When dawn came, the sun rose red and heavy over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plain. Alexander, mounted on his horse Bucephalus, rode before his troops. He wore no crown, only a simple helmet, his armor shining faintly in the morning light. Turning to his men, he spoke, not as a god, but as a leader who had marched beside them through storms, deserts, and blood. He reminded them of what they had accomplished: the crossing of the Hellespont, the fall of Tyre, the liberation of Egypt. He told them that today, they would not just defeat an army, they would conquer an empire. And when he finished, the soldiers roared, striking their spears against their shields in unison, their voices echoing across the plain. The battle began with a thunderous charge. The Persian scythed chariots rushed forward, their spinning blades meant to cut down entire lines of infantry. But Alexander had anticipated this. His men opened their ranks just as the chariots approached, allowing them to pass harmlessly through. As they did, Macedonian soldiers struck at the horses and drivers, cutting them down one by one. The ground shook beneath the weight of cavalry as the Persians tried to encircle the Macedonian line, but Alexander's strategy was already in motion. He had arranged his troops in a slanted formation, with the right flank extended forward and the left slightly withdrawn. It was a move of calculated brilliance, one that forced Darius to stretch his own line, creating a gap in the Persian center. As the Persians moved to envelop Alexander's right, he suddenly wheeled his cavalry inward, driving straight through the gap. The companion cavalry, his elite mounted warriors, followed him like a storm, spears leveled, voices shouting in unison. They crashed into the Persian center with unstoppable force, cutting through the ranks toward Darius himself. The great king, seeing Alexander charging directly at him, lost his nerve. For the second time, he fled the field, abandoning his army. Chaos rippled through the Persian lines. Soldiers began to panic, horses screamed, and elephants turned on their own handlers. Alexander pressed forward relentlessly, his blade flashing in the sunlight. He had no interest in prisoners, his only goal was victory. Behind him, the Macedonian phalanx advanced with deadly precision, their sarissas striking like a field of spears in motion. But even amid victory, Alexander's discipline never wavered. When he heard that Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, captured after Issus, were nearby, he ensured they were treated with respect and dignity. To him, conquest was not about cruelty. It was about order, legacy, and destiny. Yet destiny demanded blood, and that day at Gaugamela, the earth drank deeply. By the time the sun set, the Persian army had collapsed. The plain was littered with bodies, broken chariots, and fallen banners. Darius was gone, fleeing east into the heart of his empire, a king without a kingdom. Alexander stood victorious, his army battered but unbroken. The road to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the very heart of Persia, now lay open before him. The Macedonians had done the impossible, they had brought down the greatest empire the world had ever known. That night, as Alexander stood on the silent battlefield, the stars glimmered above him, and for a moment he felt the vastness of what he had achieved. In a single generation, the Greeks had avenged the invasions of Xerxes and Darius I, the ancient wounds of Marathon and Thermopylae had been healed. He had done what no man before him had even dared to dream. Yet as the fires of Gaugamela faded into the night, there was a question that lingered in the air: what happens when the conqueror runs out of worlds to conquer? Alexander did not pause to answer it. Within days, he marched toward Babylon, the ancient city that had stood for centuries as the symbol of Eastern power. When he entered it, he was greeted not as an invader, but as a king. The priests of Marduk came to him in reverence, and the people of the city welcomed him with offerings and garlands. Babylon had seen many conquerors, but none like this. For the first time in history, East and West had bowed to the same ruler. In the months that followed, Alexander took Susa and then Persepolis, the golden heart of the Persian Empire. There, amid its palaces and treasures, he stood before the throne of the great kings, the same throne that Darius had once occupied. It was said that he sat upon it in silence, gazing at the splendor around him, realizing that he now held the power of centuries in his hands. But his victory at Persepolis would also mark a turning point, one that revealed not just his greatness, but his human flaws. Because beneath the glory and triumph, the fire that burned within Alexander was not just ambition. It was obsession. The divine destiny he believed in was becoming an all-consuming flame, and soon it would begin to burn everything, and everyone, around him. Part 6, The Fire of the King of Kings. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he did not merely conquer a city, he walked into the beating heart of a civilization that had ruled the world for 2 centuries. The Persian Empire, the vast dominion that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, now lay at his feet. The palaces of Xerxes and Darius, built with the labor of countless nations, glittered under the torchlight like frozen gold. Columns carved with the faces of kings and lions watched silently as a new master arrived, one who was not Persian by birth but who had claimed the empire by right of his sword. It was the moment when Alexander ceased to be simply the king of Macedon. Now, he was king of kings. At first, he stood in awe of what he had achieved. The throne of Persia, once the symbol of power that Greek children were taught to fear, was now his to command. When he sat upon it, surrounded by courtiers in jeweled robes and guards in golden helmets, there was a strange stillness in the air, as though the ghosts of the old kings lingered, watching him. To many of his companions, the victory over Darius and the fall of Persepolis marked the completion of their mission. They had avenged Greece, crushed Persia, and restored glory to their homeland. But Alexander's gaze stretched further than theirs. To him, this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far greater, an empire that would unite the known world under one rule, one vision, and one destiny. But the victory carried a shadow. For all his admiration of Persian culture, Alexander could not ignore what Persepolis represented. It was the living symbol of the empire that had once tried to enslave Greece. The city's beauty was undeniable, but beneath that beauty lay the memory of humiliation, the burning of Athens, the sacking of Greek temples, the arrogance of Persian kings who once called themselves divine. To the Macedonian soldiers who had bled for every inch of their conquest, Persepolis was not a monument to admire, it was a trophy to be claimed. The decision that followed remains one of the most controversial in Alexander's life. After months of occupying the city, hosting feasts, and gathering its treasures, he held a grand celebration to honor his victories. The palace was filled with music, wine, and revelry. As the night grew darker and the fires blazed brighter, the lines between triumph and madness began to blur. According to some accounts, it was Thais, a beautiful and fiery Athenian courtesan, who raised her cup and declared that the gods would be pleased if the man who conquered Asia also avenged Greece by destroying the city from which the Persian kings had once set forth to burn Athens. In that drunken moment, with torches flickering and voices roaring approval, Alexander rose. He seized a torch and, with the crowd following, marched through the great halls of Xerxes' palace. Flames leapt onto the wooden beams, crawling up the pillars, devouring the painted walls. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Within hours, Persepolis, the most magnificent city in the world, was engulfed in an inferno. The night sky glowed red, the air thick with smoke and the sound of collapsing roofs. When dawn broke, the palace was reduced to ashes. The marble floors were cracked and blackened, the treasures of centuries melted into twisted shapes. Some said that Alexander wept when he saw the destruction in daylight, realizing that in his moment of drunken fury, he had burned the greatest achievement of Persian civilization. Others believed he intended it from the start, that it was a deliberate act of vengeance and dominance. Whatever the truth, the burning of Persepolis became both a symbol of Alexander's victory and a warning of the dangerous pride that was beginning to consume him. In the aftermath, his focus shifted to the east. Darius was still alive, fleeing further into the depths of his empire, gathering what little loyalty remained. Alexander could not allow that. To rule Persia fully, he needed Darius dead or captured. So the hunt began, a relentless pursuit through deserts, mountains, and endless plains. His army, hardened and unyielding, followed him without hesitation. They crossed lands that no Greek army had ever seen before, through searing heat and biting cold, through territories filled with hostile tribes and treacherous terrain. Along the way, Alexander began to adopt more and more elements of Persian culture. He dressed in their royal robes, sat upon their throne, and surrounded himself with Eastern advisors. To many of his Macedonian companions, this was unsettling. They had followed a Greek king, but now they saw before them a ruler who seemed half divine, half foreign. Some whispered that he had begun to think of himself as a god, especially after Egypt's oracle had hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. The simple discipline of Macedonian leadership was giving way to the grandeur and ceremony of Persian monarchy. When at last Alexander found Darius, it was not on the battlefield. The great king had been betrayed by his own satraps. As Alexander approached, he discovered the Persian ruler lying in a cart, stabbed and left to die by those who once swore loyalty to him. According to the chronicles, Darius, bleeding and broken, looked upon Alexander with fading eyes and thanked him for treating his family with honor. In his final moments, the last king of Persia entrusted his empire to the man who had defeated him. Alexander covered the dying king with his own cloak, a gesture of respect between two conquerors, and ordered that Darius be buried with all the honors of his ancestors. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid Empire, the greatest power the ancient world had known, was officially gone. Alexander was now its master, not by lineage, but by conquest. Yet his ambition did not rest. He began to see himself not merely as a Greek or Macedonian, but as the ruler of all humanity, destined to merge East and West into a single world. To achieve this, he needed not just armies, but loyalty. He married Roxana, a beautiful princess from Bactria, sealing an alliance with the local nobility. His men followed his example, taking Persian wives, adopting Persian customs, and learning Persian tongues. To the older Macedonians, this transformation felt like betrayal. They grumbled that their king was becoming too Persian, too divine, too distant. But to Alexander, it was necessity. He believed that if he could blend the cultures of Greece and Persia, he could forge an empire that would never fracture, a world bound not by force, but by shared identity. It was an idea centuries ahead of its time, but it also isolated him from those who once stood closest to him. For now, though, the dream of unity burned bright within him. The deserts of Persia lay conquered, the kings of the East had bowed before him, and the name of Alexander echoed across continents. Yet deep within, the same fire that had driven him to greatness was beginning to flicker into something darker. He had defeated his greatest rival. He had surpassed his father's ambition. He had become the ruler of the world's largest empire. But for a man who saw limits as insults to destiny, the question remained, what comes after conquering the world? Part 7, The Edge of the Known World. The Persian Empire had fallen. Its kings were dead, its cities burned, its treasuries emptied. Yet Alexander's ambition, like the horizon before him, only kept expanding. For most men, the conquest of Persia would have been the summit of greatness, a triumph that demanded rest and celebration. But for Alexander, it was not enough. He looked east, toward lands that shimmered like mirages, places whispered about in Greek markets and travelers' tales. Bactria, Sogdiana, the mysterious kingdoms beyond the Oxus River, territories where the map itself began to blur into myth. To his generals, these were barren lands not worth the struggle. To Alexander, they were unfinished lines in the story of his destiny. And so, in the spring of 330 BC, he marched onward, into the heart of Central Asia, where the empire of dreams would be tested by the harshness of reality. The journey eastward was not one of glory, but of endurance. The further Alexander's army pushed, the less they resembled conquerors and the more they seemed like wanderers lost in an alien world. The climate shifted from scorching plains to icy mountains. Sandstorms blinded them by day, freezing winds battered them by night. Supplies ran short, and many soldiers began to wonder whether their godlike king had finally lost his reason. The local tribes did not fight in great armies as the Persians had, they struck in the shadows, disappearing into the mountains before retaliation could come. These were not battles of honor, but ambushes fought in silence, where courage mattered less than patience. It was in these lands that Alexander's legend began to darken. The conqueror who had faced kings now faced rebels, guerrillas, and ghosts. His discipline hardened into obsession. Every village that resisted was burned, every leader who defied him was hunted without mercy. Yet amid this unforgiving campaign, a new figure entered his life, a woman who would change the rhythm of his heart, even as his world began to unravel. Her name was Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, renowned for her beauty and spirit. When Alexander met her, the air of command and calculation that had defined him seemed to soften. In her, he saw not just an alliance but a mirror of his own wild defiance. Their marriage, performed according to Persian customs, symbolized more than love. It was a union of East and West, the embodiment of his dream to blend nations into one. To the Persians, it was a sign of respect. To the Macedonians, it was a troubling departure. The men who had followed him from Pella began to whisper in their tents, their king no longer belonged to them. Still, the campaign pressed on. Bactria was brought to heel, but Sogdiana, a region of rocky cliffs and hidden fortresses, refused to yield. One fortress, built atop a sheer mountain that seemed to touch the sky, was considered impregnable. Its defenders mocked Alexander from above, shouting that he would need men with wings to take it. Alexander's response was pure audacity. He called for volunteers, offering great rewards to any soldier who could climb the cliff under the cover of night. 300 men stepped forward. With only iron stakes and ropes, they scaled the vertical rock face in silence, their hands bleeding, their breath freezing in the cold air. By dawn, they stood on the summit. When the defenders awoke, they saw, to their horror, what appeared to be winged men standing above them. Terrified, they surrendered. The fortress fell without a fight. This victory, while small compared to Gaugamela or Issus, revealed something deeper about Alexander's mind. He was no longer fighting for territory, he was waging war against the very idea of limitation. Every obstacle had to be conquered, every impossibility proven false. Yet that same hunger for the unattainable was beginning to consume him. His men were exhausted, they had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and seen no end in sight. They began to grumble more openly, questioning why their king refused to return home. Alexander heard their complaints, but he did not forgive them. The more resistance he faced, the more divine he believed his purpose to be. His advisors noticed a shift in his behavior, the quick temper, the suspicion toward old friends, the increasing belief that he was not merely mortal. Some said the oracle of Zeus Ammon had planted that seed of divinity in his mind back in Egypt, now it had taken root and grown into something dangerous. The tension between the Macedonians and their king reached a breaking point in Bactra. Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who had once saved his life in battle, grew drunk during a feast and mocked Alexander's growing arrogance. He reminded him of his mortal father, Philip, and accused him of forgetting the men who had helped him rise. Alexander, equally drunk, snapped. In a flash of rage, he seized a spear and drove it through Clitus's heart. The hall fell silent. The man who had once been his brother in arms now lay dead at his feet. The reality of what he had done struck Alexander like a physical blow. He collapsed beside Clitus's body, weeping uncontrollably, refusing food and sleep for days. Those who saw him said it was the first time they had witnessed their king's invincible spirit break. Yet even in remorse, Alexander's obsession with destiny did not waver. He convinced himself that such acts, however tragic, were the burden of greatness, that the gods demanded sacrifices, even of friendship. As the campaigns dragged on, the lines between soldier, ruler, and god began to blur. Alexander began adopting Persian court customs, expecting his men to bow before him, a gesture they saw as servile and foreign. Some resisted, believing no Greek should kneel before another man. But Alexander was no longer content to be another man. He demanded recognition not just as a king but as something eternal, something beyond human measure. And yet, even as he claimed divine heritage, Alexander remained haunted by mortality. He could conquer nations, but he could not conquer the quiet loneliness that came with power. The men who had once stood beside him now walked behind him, fearful rather than loyal. The world had bowed before him, but he was beginning to sense that the higher he climbed, the fewer voices there were to speak the truth. By the time he reached the edges of Central Asia, his empire stretched farther than any in history. The Greek world lay behind him, and before him rose the towering mountains that guarded India, a land of elephants, monsoons, and kingdoms untouched by Greek ambition. To most, it was the end of the world. To Alexander, it was another beginning. The King of Kings had become restless once more. The deserts of Persia were not enough. The mountains of Sogdiana were not enough. Even love and empire were not enough. The fire that burned in him, the divine spark that had carried him from Macedon to the ends of the earth, was now pushing him toward his greatest, and perhaps most fateful, challenge, India. Part 8, The River of Kings. By the year 327 BC, the world had grown weary of Alexander's shadow, yet the man himself showed no sign of exhaustion. His empire stretched from the mountains of Macedonia to the deserts of Persia, from the palaces of Babylon to the icy fortresses of Bactria. And still, he looked eastward. Beyond the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush lay the fabled land of India, a place the Greeks had only heard of in myths and merchant tales. To most men, the idea of marching there was madness. But to Alexander, it was inevitable. The world, he believed, had no edge. There was always something more to conquer, another horizon to reach, another god to challenge. He had begun his journey as a man seeking glory. Now, he marched as one chasing eternity. The journey into India was one of the most grueling in Alexander's career. The Hindu Kush mountains loomed like jagged walls of ice and stone, the kind of terrain that could break even the strongest armies. As the Macedonian soldiers climbed, they faced blinding snowstorms, treacherous cliffs, and thin air that left them gasping. Horses slipped on icy paths, men froze in their sleep, and supply lines vanished behind the endless ridges. Yet Alexander pressed on, riding ahead of his men, refusing to slow down. He believed that if he hesitated, even for a moment, the dream that drove him would begin to fade. When they finally descended from the mountains into the lush valleys of the Punjab, it was as though they had stepped into another world. Rivers wound through green plains, elephants roamed the forests, and the air itself seemed heavy with life. The people they encountered were unlike any the Macedonians had seen, clothed in bright fabrics, armed with long bows, and riding beasts the Greeks had only imagined. To the Indian kings, Alexander was no divine figure, he was a foreign invader. And among those kings, one name would become legend: Porus. King Porus ruled a vast territory on the banks of the Hydaspes River, a ruler of immense strength and dignity. He was said to stand a head taller than any man, with eyes that burned with the pride of a warrior. When Alexander sent envoys demanding his submission, Porus replied with a message that has echoed through history: "I shall meet Alexander in battle, as a king meets a king." It was not a boast, it was a promise. The Hydaspes River itself posed the first challenge. It was wide, deep, and violent with monsoon floods. Porus positioned his army on the far bank, confident that Alexander could not cross without being seen. His army was formidable: thousands of infantry, chariots, cavalry, and more than 200 war elephants, their tusks armored, their backs carrying towers filled with archers. The Macedonians had never faced such creatures before. To them, the elephants seemed like living fortresses, snorting, trumpeting, and shaking the earth with every step. For days, Alexander studied the river, riding up and down its banks, searching for a way across. Porus shadowed his movements, always keeping his army opposite him. Then one night, during a thunderstorm that masked the sounds of movement, Alexander made his move. Taking a portion of his army, the elite companion cavalry and select infantry, he crossed upstream under cover of darkness. The rain poured down in sheets, lightning flashed across the sky, and the river roared like a living thing. By dawn, Alexander had reached the opposite bank. His men, soaked and exhausted, formed ranks as the first of Porus's scouts arrived to sound the alarm. What followed was one of the most extraordinary battles in ancient history. The open plains became a storm of chaos and thunder. Porus advanced with his elephants leading the charge, their massive bodies crushing men and horses alike. the Macedonian cavalry darted around them, hurling javelins, while the phalanx held its ground with desperate discipline. The air was filled with the screams of men, the trumpeting of elephants, and the clash of steel on steel. Alexander himself led from the front, as always, his presence like a living flame amid the storm. But this was not a battle of simple conquest, it was a duel between two kings, one from the west, one from the east. When Alexander's cavalry managed to encircle the Indian army, Porus refused to retreat. He fought from the back of his elephant, towering above the battlefield, his armor soaked in blood, his commands carrying over the roar of combat. Even when his army began to crumble, he stood firm, wounded but unyielding. Alexander, seeing such courage, ordered his men to spare him. When the fighting ended, the Macedonian king rode out to meet the Indian ruler face to face. According to the chronicles, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated. The defeated king, still proud even in chains, replied, "Like a king." For a moment, silence hung between them, and then Alexander smiled. "So be it," he said. In that instant, conqueror and conquered became equals. Alexander not only spared Porus's life but restored his kingdom and made him an ally. It was one of the few times in his campaigns where victory gave birth to respect rather than destruction. The Battle of the Hydaspes marked the furthest reach of Alexander's conquests. It was a triumph of courage, strategy, and endurance, but it also revealed something more profound about the man behind the legend. Alexander had faced his most worthy opponent, and in doing so, he glimpsed a reflection of himself, a ruler who valued honor above power and dignity above fear. Yet even as the rivers of India flowed red with blood, the fire within him refused to fade. After the battle, Alexander continued deeper into India, chasing rumors of great kingdoms and distant oceans. But his men had reached their breaking point. The years of endless marching, of strange lands and unfamiliar faces, had drained them. The rain poured endlessly, the jungles teemed with fever and disease, and the promise of glory began to feel like a curse. When Alexander announced his intention to continue east, toward the Ganges, toward lands no Greek had ever seen, his soldiers finally refused. They stood in silence, weary and defiant, and their refusal cut deeper than any wound he had received in battle. For the first time in his life, Alexander faced a force he could not conquer, the will of his own men. He withdrew to his tent and sat for hours, motionless, staring at the map before him. He had reached the edge of the known world, but his dream of uniting it all remained unfinished. When he emerged, his voice was calm but heavy with sorrow. "The gods," he said, "have decreed that the world has limits. But perhaps they have made me to show how far those limits can be pushed." And so, at last, Alexander ordered the return march. He would not conquer new lands, but he would make the journey home a triumph of endurance. Yet in the jungles and rivers of India, a quiet truth had begun to unfold: the conqueror of worlds had met his own boundary, not in geography, but in human exhaustion. He had crossed the Hydaspes as a god among men, but he would return across the deserts as a man haunted by gods. Part 9: The March Through Desolation. The Battle of the Hydaspes had crowned Alexander as the master of the known world, but it also marked the point where ambition began to turn against him. His men had followed him through mountains, deserts, and storms. They had crossed rivers that swallowed armies and faced creatures they had never imagined. They had fought for glory, for gold, for the vision of a king who spoke as though the gods whispered in his ear. But now, standing in the humid jungles of India, they wanted only one thing: to go home. For years, they had seen nothing but blood and dust. Their armor had rusted in the rain, their skin burned by the sun, their spirits hollowed by endless war. Even victory had begun to taste like ash. When Alexander announced his desire to march further east, to reach the Ganges and conquer lands beyond imagination, a heavy silence fell over the camp. It was not the silence of obedience, it was the silence of exhaustion. The soldiers did not argue, but they did not cheer. The gods themselves seemed to have grown tired of conquest. Finally, one of his officers, Cenas, stepped forward and spoke what every man was thinking. He told Alexander that they were weary, that their hearts yearned for home, and that it was time to stop. The word struck the king like an arrow. For the first time, his army had defied him. Alexander withdrew to his tent and stayed there for 3 days, refusing to see anyone. The man who had stared down empires now sat alone, staring at the edges of his map, where the parchment simply ended. He had reached the boundaries of the known world, and found no more worlds left to conquer. On the 4th day, he emerged and addressed his army. His voice was calm, but the fire that had driven him burned low. "If we must turn back," he said, "then let our return be worthy of the gods." The men cheered, relieved, though they did not realize the horror that awaited them on the road home. Instead of retracing his path through Bactria, Alexander chose a new route, a daring, almost reckless journey through the Gedrosian Desert, a vast wasteland of sand and salt stretching across what is now southern Pakistan. It was said to be cursed, a place where even the Persians had lost entire armies. But Alexander was determined to prove that no land, no matter how cruel, could break his will. It was a decision born of pride, and it would cost him more than any battle. The march began under a blazing sun that showed no mercy. The heat was so intense that the armor burned against the soldier's skin. The sand reflected the light like fire, and the horizon shimmered with illusions of water that vanished as they approached. Men collapsed by the dozens each day, their lips cracked, their throats dry as stone. Horses and camels died where they stood, and their carcasses were left to the vultures. Even Alexander, who had endured every hardship alongside his men, began to weaken. To keep morale alive, he refused any special privilege. When his scouts brought him a small helmet filled with water, the only they could find after hours of searching, Alexander looked at the parched faces of his soldiers and poured it onto the ground before them. "What good is water to me," he said, "when so many thirst?" The act renewed their spirit, but the desert did not relent. Days turned into weeks, and the endless dunes seemed to stretch into eternity. At night, the stars burned brighter than they ever had before, sharp and cold against the black sky. Some said the gods were watching. Others whispered that they had been abandoned. The soldiers began to dream of rivers and rain, of green valleys and the blue seas of Greece. But when they woke, all they saw was sand, an ocean of it, swallowing every hope. Thousands perished before the army finally reached the shores of the Arabian Sea. By the time they emerged from the desert, Alexander's army was a shadow of what it once had been. Yet even in ruin, his pride remained unbroken. He ordered ships to be built along the coast and sent part of his army under his admiral, Nearchus, to sail back to Persia while he led the rest north by land. The march through the desert had become more than a journey, it was a test of the divine fire that had guided him all his life. He had faced nature itself, and though it had scarred him, he had not yielded. When he finally returned to the lands of Persia, Alexander was no longer just a conqueror. He was a man haunted by what he had seen, burdened by the weight of empire. The soldiers who had once shouted his name in triumph now followed in silence. They respected him still, but the reverence had turned to something closer to fear. For they saw in his eyes the look of someone who had gone too far, a man who had wrestled with destiny and survived, but not unchanged. In the great city of Susa, Alexander sought to heal the wounds of his empire. He organized mass weddings between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, hoping to unite East and West through blood and kinship. He himself married Roxana and 2 Persian princesses, symbolizing the fusion of 2 worlds. Yet, not everyone shared his vision. Many of his men resented the new customs, the Persian robes, the rituals that felt foreign to them. They whispered that their king had become too Eastern, too distant, too godlike. When some of his officers plotted against him, Alexander reacted with brutal force. He had once executed those who challenged him in battle, now he began executing those who questioned him in thought. Even his oldest friends, like Clitus the Black, the man who had once saved his life, fell victim to his rage. During a drunken feast, when Clitus criticized him for abandoning Macedonian traditions, Alexander, in a blind fury, drove a spear through his friend's chest. The moment the rage subsided, he collapsed in grief, unable to believe what he had done. The conqueror who had slain kings and armies was now crushed by the death of a friend. In the following months, Alexander's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began to see himself not merely as a king but as a living god. He demanded divine honors, and his followers, fearful or fascinated, obeyed. The boy who had once dreamed of Achilles now believed himself to have surpassed him. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was a growing loneliness, a realization that no man could live at the height of the gods for long. Still, his ambition burned. He planned new expeditions, new roads, new cities. He spoke of conquering Arabia next, of sailing west to Carthage, of pushing his empire to the edge of the known world once more. But fate had already begun to whisper a different story. For even gods must rest. Part 10, The Final Return to Babylon. The march through the Gedrosian desert had changed everything. The soldiers who stumbled out of that inferno no longer resembled the proud warriors who had crossed the Hellespont years earlier. They were ghosts in armor, survivors of something that felt less like a campaign and more like divine punishment. And yet, at their head still rode Alexander, gaunt, sunburned, and scarred, but unbowed. When the column reached the fertile plains of Persia, it felt as if they had returned from another world. Cities rose again along the horizon. Rivers shimmered under the sun. The people came out to greet their king, bringing offerings and songs. But in their hearts, many wondered whether the man before them was still fully human. When Alexander re-entered Babylon in 324 BCE, it was as though the world itself had bent to his will. From Greece to Egypt, from the mountains of Persia to the borders of India, his empire stretched farther than any before him. Babylon, once the jewel of Mesopotamia, became his new capital, the heart of a world that had no rival. It was there that he began to imagine his final transformation, from conqueror of men to unifier of nations, from king to god. The streets of the ancient city swelled with soldiers, courtiers, philosophers, astronomers, and envoys from every corner of the known world. Babylon became a living symbol of his vision, a place where Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures collided and merged under his rule. But beneath the grandeur, there was unease. The soldiers, weary from endless campaigns, looked upon the new ceremonies with suspicion. Alexander appeared in Persian robes, surrounded by Eastern advisors and priests. He spoke of divine lineage and demanded proskynesis, the act of bowing before him as if before a god. To the Persians, it was natural. To the Macedonians, it was blasphemy. They had followed him as a man, not a deity. The tension between the conqueror and his men, long suppressed by fear and awe, began to surface in whispers. Despite the murmurs, Alexander pressed forward with his plans. He envisioned a vast empire that would outlive him, a world knit together not by conquest, but by unity. To achieve this, he announced another grand ceremony, the Susa weddings, where thousands of Macedonian soldiers would marry Persian women in a single celebration of harmony. It was a breathtaking spectacle, music, incense, jewels, and silk filling the air with beauty. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, Statira and Persides, alongside his beloved Roxana. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he truly believed that love and ceremony could mend the scars of war. Yet harmony built on exhaustion is fragile. The men accepted their marriages reluctantly, and many soon abandoned their new wives once the ceremony ended. The dream of blending East and West, though noble in idea, remained a vision only Alexander could see. He wanted to create a new world, but his soldiers still longed for the old one. Amid the celebrations, tragedy struck. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, his confidant, the one man who had stood beside him from childhood to conquest, fell ill. Some said it was from fever, others whispered it was poison or exhaustion. For days, Alexander refused to leave his side, calling upon every physician, priest, and oracle he could find. When Hephaestion finally died, something inside Alexander shattered. The grief consumed him like wildfire. He fasted for days, tore his garments, and ordered an empire-wide mourning. The man who had conquered continents could not conquer death. In his anguish, he declared Hephaestion a demigod and demanded temples be built in his honor. His sorrow turned to fury when he discovered that the physician had failed to save his friend. The man was executed without trial. The same king who had once wept for a fallen soldier now lashed out like a wounded beast. Babylon watched as Alexander's mourning turned into madness. He cut his hair short in mourning, like Achilles before him, and refused comfort from anyone. Those who approached him spoke in whispers, fearful that grief had driven their god-king beyond reason. Yet, as he always did, Alexander eventually turned pain into purpose. He began planning a new campaign, this time to Arabia. Maps were drawn, ships constructed, supply routes plotted. Even after a decade of ceaseless war, he was restless. There are still worlds to discover, he told his generals. But his voice no longer carried the same fire. It trembled with fatigue, and his body, once tireless, began to betray him. He had suffered wounds in nearly every campaign, and though he never admitted weakness, those around him saw it in his eyes, a growing shadow that even the greatest of men could not ignore. The Babylonian summer was cruel that year. The air was heavy, thick with humidity and dust. The Euphrates shimmered beneath a relentless sun, and disease festered in the swamps surrounding the city. One night, after a long banquet filled with wine and laughter, Alexander began to feel a sudden fever. He dismissed it at first, he had faced worse. But as the days passed, the fever grew worse. He grew weak, his voice faint, his movements slow. The physicians tended to him, but their remedies did little. He could no longer eat or speak without pain. Rumors spread like wildfire through the palace. Some said it was poison, others that the gods were finally calling their son home. His generals crowded around his bedside, watching helplessly as the man who had once seemed immortal withered before their eyes. Alexander's eyes still burned with intensity, but now there was something else in them, a quiet acceptance, perhaps even peace. In his final days, he could barely lift his head, but he continued to give orders, dictating his plans for Arabia, organizing the empire's administration, and requesting offerings to the gods. When his men came to see him, they filed past in silence. Too weak to speak, he raised his hand in acknowledgement, his fingers trembling, a silent farewell to those who had followed him through fire and storm. On June 10, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, lord of Asia, pharaoh of Egypt, and self-proclaimed son of Zeus, took his final breath in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He was 32 years old. The man who had crossed continents, who had defeated kings and reshaped the world, died not by the sword, but by the slow, inescapable decay of the human body. Outside the palace, the soldiers who had conquered the world stood in disbelief. Some wept openly, others refused to accept it. How could Alexander, the man who never lost a battle, who claimed descent from gods, die like any other mortal? Yet, perhaps it was fitting. For in death, he became what he had always sought to be, eternal. His name, his story, his legend, they would never die. In the days that followed, chaos erupted. His generals demanded to know who would inherit his empire. According to legend, Alexander whispered his final words, to the strongest. Whether he truly said it or not, those words would shape the fate of the world for centuries to come. The empire he had built through vision and blood began to fracture even before his body was cold. As the torches flickered in the halls of Babylon, and the echo of his name faded into the night, the question that haunted the ages was born: did Alexander conquer the world, or did the world conquer him? Part 11, The Shattered Empire. When Alexander the Great took his final breath in the palace of Babylon, the world seemed to hold its own. The torches that burned in the grand hall flickered, and for a brief moment, the empire stood in stunned silence. He had been the one constant in a world of chaos, the unbreakable will that had bound together a realm stretching from Greece to India. Now that will was gone, and what remained was an empire too vast, too fragile, and too dependent on one man to survive him. The news of his death spread like a shockwave through the lands he had conquered. In the east, satraps paused uncertainly, wondering whether to remain loyal or declare independence. In the west, soldiers wept, cursed, and whispered that their god-king could not truly be dead. And in Babylon itself, the men who had shared his victories began to circle one another like wolves. There was no clear heir. Roxana, his Bactrian queen, was pregnant, but the child's fate was uncertain. Alexander had a half-brother, Aristetle, the son of Philip II by another wife, but he was mentally unfit to rule. In a world driven by power, such weakness was fatal. Within days, the once united generals of Alexander's army, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder at Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes, began plotting against each other. They gathered in the royal palace, where Alexander's body still lay, preserved in honey to delay decay. The question was simple, yet it threatened to tear the world apart: who would rule the empire of Alexander the Great? Perdiccas, one of Alexander's most trusted officers, seized control of the royal signet ring, claiming authority as regent until the birth of Roxana's child. To some, it seemed the natural choice; to others, it was the first step toward tyranny. Meleager, a leader of the infantry, opposed him fiercely, arguing that the soldiers, not the nobles, should decide the fate of the empire. The army split in two, cavalry supporting Perdiccas, infantry backing Meleager. The same men who had conquered Asia together now pointed swords at one another over the shadow of a dead king. To calm the tension, a compromise was reached. Roxana's unborn child, if male, would be king. Until then, the empire would be ruled jointly by Aridaeus, who became Philip III, and the expected heir, Alexander IV. Perdiccas would serve as regent, the real power behind the throne. The settlement seemed to restore order, but in truth, it was only a fragile truce, a bandage placed over a wound that could never heal. The empire was too vast, the ambitions too great, the loyalties too thin. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. As Alexander's body lay in Babylon, a new conflict arose over his burial. According to Macedonian custom, kings were to be buried in their homeland, but Egypt, with its ancient tombs and divine aura, offered a more fitting resting place for a man who had declared himself a god. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most loyal generals and the governor of Egypt, saw opportunity in this sacred act. He intercepted the royal funeral procession as it traveled west, seizing the coffin and bringing it to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, where it would become the symbol of his own authority. The theft of Alexander's body was more than a political maneuver, it was a declaration. The age of unity had ended. The age of the successors had begun. Perdiccas, furious at Ptolemy's defiance, declared war. The armies that had once marched together now clashed on opposite sides of the same field. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, would rage for decades, reshaping the ancient world into fragments of a once mighty dream. In the name of Alexander, his generals tore apart everything he had built. As Perdiccas prepared his campaign against Egypt, his power began to crumble from within. His harsh rule and overreaching ambition alienated his allies. When his attempt to cross the Nile failed disastrously, with thousands drowning in the river's swift current, his soldiers mutinied. Betrayed by his own officers, Perdiccas was cut down in his tent, the first of many successors to die in pursuit of Alexander's ghost. With Perdiccas dead, the empire fractured further. Antipater ruled Macedonia, Ptolemy held Egypt, Antigonus controlled much of Asia Minor, Seleucus rose in Babylon, and Lysimachus governed Thrace. Each man claimed to defend Alexander's legacy, but in truth, each sought to carve his own kingdom from the corpse of the empire. The child king, Alexander IV, and his mother Roxana became pawns in their struggle, symbols of legitimacy passed from one general to another like relics of a forgotten faith. In the east, Seleucus, shrewd and calculating, began building what would become the Seleucid Empire, a realm of Greek cities stretching from Syria to the borders of India. In Egypt, Ptolemy fortified his rule, transforming the Nile Delta into a beacon of Hellenistic culture. Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, blossomed under his care, becoming the intellectual capital of the world, a place where Greek philosophy met Egyptian mysticism and Persian science. But for all its brilliance, it was a monument to division, not unity. The dream of one world under one ruler had died with Alexander. As the years passed, the wars grew bloodier. Alliances shifted like desert winds. Brothers turned on brothers, friends on friends. Antigonus the One-Eyed sought to reunify the empire under his rule, and for a moment, it seemed he might succeed. But at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, the combined forces of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander crushed him, ending the last real chance of restoration. The world that Alexander had conquered was now divided into kingdoms, Macedon, Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, each ruled by men who once swore loyalty to him, each claiming to carry forward his vision while destroying it in practice. The fate of Alexander's family was no less tragic. Roxana and her young son, Alexander IV, lived under constant threat. Cassander, ruling Macedon, saw the boy as a rival. To secure his own power, he ordered their execution in secret, extinguishing the last bloodline of the great conqueror. The world that Alexander had built with courage and vision was now ruled by those who had murdered his memory. Yet even as the empire broke apart, Alexander's legend refused to die. In every corner of the Hellenistic world, his name lingered like a sacred echo. Poets compared him to Heracles, philosophers debated his divinity, kings modeled themselves after him. His face appeared on coins, his image carved into temples, his deeds immortalized in stories that spread across continents. Though his empire had shattered, his idea had survived, the fusion of East and West, of civilization and conquest, of man and God. In Egypt, beneath the shadow of the lighthouse of Alexandria, pilgrims came from across the world to gaze upon his golden sarcophagus. Generals, philosophers, and emperors alike would stand before it, in awe of the man who had once ruled the earth and in quiet dread of what his death had unleashed. For in conquering the world, Alexander had also revealed its greatest truth, that no empire, no matter how vast or glorious, can outlast the ambitions that built it. Part 12, The Unraveling of a Dream. The great conquest that had once seemed unstoppable was beginning to lose its rhythm. The endless march eastward had brought Alexander and his army to the very edges of the known world, but as they pushed further into India, the weight of exhaustion and longing began to break even the most loyal hearts among his men. The dreams of glory that had once united them were slowly being overshadowed by fatigue, disease, and the haunting question, how much farther must they go before it would be enough? Alexander, however, was not a man easily satisfied by the limits of maps or the weariness of soldiers. His mind was still ablaze with visions of divine destiny, of becoming a conqueror who would reach the ends of the earth and touch the unknown beyond. But the farther he pushed, the more he began to lose control of what he had once so carefully commanded, not just the loyalty of his army, but the stability of his empire, and perhaps, even himself. When Alexander marched his army deeper into India, he encountered not just the heat, humidity, and strange new terrain, but a resistance that tested every ounce of his military genius. The local kings and tribes were fierce defenders of their lands, uniting in ways that echoed the Greeks' own defiance against Persia years before. Among them was King Porus of the Paurava kingdom, a ruler known for his courage and immense stature. The encounter between Alexander and Porus would become one of the most legendary battles of his campaign, the Battle of the Hydaspes River. The conditions were brutal. Torrential rains turned the ground into a sea of mud, and the river, swollen and treacherous, separated the two armies. Porus commanded war elephants, massive, towering beasts that the Macedonian soldiers had never faced before. As Alexander surveyed the battlefield, he realized this would not be a fight of numbers or formations, but of adaptability and willpower. The battle that followed was one of the most extraordinary displays of Alexander's tactical brilliance. Under cover of darkness and rain, he executed a daring river crossing with a portion of his army, deceiving Porus into believing that he would attack elsewhere. When the sun rose, the Macedonians emerged from the mist, catching Porus by surprise. The elephants charged forward, their tusks adorned with blades, their sheer force breaking through ranks of men and horses. But Alexander had anticipated the chaos. His archers and cavalry attacked the flanks, isolating the elephants from their handlers, turning Porus's greatest strength into his greatest vulnerability. The battle was savage, lasting for hours under relentless rain and cries of pain that echoed across the riverbanks. When it was over, thousands lay dead, the battlefield strewn with bodies of men and beasts alike. Porus, wounded but unbowed, was brought before Alexander. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. Instead of kneeling or begging for mercy, the Indian king stood tall before the conqueror and spoke with quiet dignity. When Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, like a king. Impressed by his courage, Alexander not only spared him but restored his kingdom and even granted him more territory. It was a moment that reflected the strange duality of Alexander's character, a man capable of immense cruelty, yet also of admiration and generosity toward those he deemed worthy. This meeting between two kings symbolized a mutual recognition of greatness, a rare moment of respect between conqueror and conquered. But for all the glory of Hydaspes, it marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign. His army, though victorious, was at its breaking point. The soldiers had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured unimaginable hardships. When Alexander expressed his desire to march even further east, toward the mysterious lands beyond the Ganges, his men refused. They longed for home, for the familiar skies of Macedon, for the families they had not seen in years. The murmurs of dissent grew into open defiance. For the first time in his life, Alexander faced a rebellion within his own ranks. He pleaded, he raged, he promised rewards beyond imagination, but nothing could move them. They had followed him to the ends of the earth, and now they were done. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed to turn back. It was perhaps one of the most painful decisions he ever made, not because of the physical retreat, but because it symbolized the shattering of his boundless vision. The great dream of conquering the world had met its first immovable obstacle, the will of his own men. The return journey, however, proved even more perilous. Instead of retracing their steps through safer routes, Alexander chose to march through the Gedrosian desert, a vast, unforgiving expanse of sand and heat that would claim the lives of thousands. It was said that men died of thirst beside their dying horses, and that the desert winds buried entire columns beneath dunes. When a small group of soldiers once managed to collect a helmet full of water and offered it to Alexander, he poured it into the sand in front of them, declaring that he would not drink while his men suffered. The gesture, though symbolic, could not erase the suffering that had become the defining feature of their return. By the time Alexander reached the Persian heartlands again, the man who had left Macedon as a young prince now returned as a legend, but also as someone far removed from the world he once knew. His empire stretched farther than any in history, but it was also fragile, stitched together by fear, admiration, and the charisma of one man. In his absence, revolts had broken out, and local governors ruled like kings. The unity that had once seemed eternal was beginning to unravel. Yet Alexander remained obsessed with his dream of integrating East and West, of creating a new world where Greeks and Persians, Europeans and Asians, would live as one. To achieve this, he began to adopt more elements of Persian culture, their dress, their rituals, even their manner of rule, a move that alienated many of his Macedonian generals. The once proud warriors who had followed him across continents now whispered that their king had become too much like the enemy they once despised. Amid these tensions, Alexander made one of his most ambitious moves, the mass marriage at Susa. In a grand ceremony, he married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, while encouraging his generals and soldiers to take Persian wives as well. It was meant to symbolize unity, the merging of two civilizations. But instead of harmony, it deepened the divide. Many of his men saw it as a betrayal of their heritage, a dilution of their Greek identity. Still, Alexander pressed on, believing that he was not just a conqueror of lands, but a builder of a new, universal world. He envisioned himself as more than mortal, a bridge between cultures, a son of Zeus, and perhaps, even a god in human form. Yet beneath the divine image, cracks were forming. The man who had once inspired loyalty now inspired fear. He executed old friends like Clitus for perceived insults, punished generals for minor failures, and surrounded himself with flatterers and mystics. The empire that had once expanded under his brilliance was now sustained by his paranoia. The boy who had sought to surpass his father and Achilles had done so, but in doing it, he had become something else entirely. The conqueror who once fought for glory was now haunted by shadows, of loss, of exhaustion, and of a destiny that no longer had a direction. As Alexander looked across the empire he had built, from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India, he began to realize that conquering the world was not the same as holding it together. The seeds of discontent were everywhere, and the dream of unity was already starting to fade. Yet still, he refused to stop. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed there was more to achieve, another horizon to chase. But destiny, as it always does, was preparing its own plan. For the man who had conquered half the world, the greatest battle was yet to come, and it would not be fought on any battlefield, but within himself. Part 13, The Fall of the Immortal King. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, the once vibrant conqueror had begun to resemble the empire he ruled, vast, powerful, and yet trembling under the weight of its own size. The city, with its grand palaces, hanging gardens, and winding rivers, had become his new capital, the heart of the world he had dreamed of uniting. Yet even amidst this magnificence, a strange heaviness hung in the air. The endless campaigns had carved deep scars in the hearts of his men and in Alexander himself. His victories were legendary, but the man who once chased glory with the fire of youth now seemed haunted by a different kind of pursuit, the search for meaning in what he had already achieved. The world lay at his feet, yet somehow, it was not enough. Alexander had changed. The lines of his face had grown sharper, his gaze more distant. The ambition that had once burned so brightly now flickered with something darker, a restlessness that no victory could soothe. He had become obsessed with consolidating his empire, turning his vast conquests into a single, functioning whole. His vision was no longer merely military, it was philosophical, almost divine. He wanted to merge East and West not just through war, but through governance, marriage, and culture. He founded cities, rebuilt temples, and ordered roads that would connect civilizations. Yet, for every order he gave, rebellion rose in some corner of his empire. The vastness of what he had created was beginning to reveal its fragility. The tension between Alexander and his Macedonian companions continued to deepen. Many of his old generals were weary of his new Persian mannerisms, the royal robes, the demand for proskynesis, the act of bowing before him as a god, and the way he now surrounded himself with foreign advisers. To men who had once dined and laughed with him as comrades, he was becoming a distant figure, elevated by divine pretense. But Alexander, in his mind, was no longer merely a man. He had become a symbol, an idea, perhaps even a myth in his own lifetime. He believed that he had surpassed the boundaries of mortality. His mother Olympias had once told him he was the son of Zeus, and now, after conquering empires and surviving countless battles, he began to believe it himself. It was around this time that fate dealt Alexander one of its cruelest blows. His closest friend and companion, Hephaestion, fell ill and died suddenly in Ecbatana. For Alexander, it was as if the sun itself had gone dark. The two had shared everything, battles, triumphs, and the quiet, unspoken bond of souls who understood each other beyond words. When Hephaestion died, a part of Alexander died with him. He locked himself away for days, refusing to eat or speak. He cut his hair in mourning, as Achilles had done for Patroclus, and ordered massive funeral rites across the empire. Thousands of animals were sacrificed, temples were built in Hephaestion's name, and Alexander demanded that he be worshipped as a divine hero. Babylon echoed with the cries of mourning, but none were louder than those that came from Alexander's own heart. The conqueror of the world could not conquer death, and that realization began to consume him. From that point onward, Alexander's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He spoke of new campaigns, of Arabia, of Carthage, even of the distant western lands that no Greek had ever seen. He dreamed of ships that would sail beyond the edge of the world, carrying his legacy forever. But his body was beginning to betray him. Years of exhaustion, wounds, and endless drinking had taken their toll. He suffered from fevers, fits of pain, and haunting dreams. His court was filled with tension and whispers. Some said he had angered the gods, others believed he was being poisoned by his own men. Babylon, once the seat of his triumph, was now a place of shadows and suspicion. In the final months of his life, Alexander seemed to drift between reality and something beyond it. He spent long hours in silence, staring at the horizon as if he could see worlds that others could not. He spoke often of Hephaestion, of Zeus, of the great ocean that marked the edge of the earth. He began to plan new expeditions, ordering fleets to be built and maps to be redrawn. His generals listened, but they did so with heavy hearts. They knew that the man standing before them, brilliant, visionary, and increasingly divine in his delusion, was slipping away. His body was strong, but his spirit seemed to be fading into the myth he had spent his life creating. Then, in June of 323 BCE, the end came suddenly. During a banquet in Babylon, Alexander fell ill after a night of heavy drinking. At first, his attendants thought it was another fever, he had suffered many before. But this time was different. His condition worsened rapidly. He lost his voice, his strength, and eventually, his ability to move. Yet even as death approached, he refused to show weakness. When his generals filed into his tent, many of them weeping, they asked him to whom he would leave his empire. Alexander, barely able to speak, whispered, "To the strongest." Those were the last words of the greatest conqueror the ancient world had ever known. For days after his death, Babylon was plunged into chaos. No one could believe that the man who had seemed immortal, the man who had faced death on 100 battlefields and triumphed, could be gone. His body did not decompose immediately, which only deepened the belief that he was indeed divine. His generals, the mighty Diadochi, soon began to quarrel over his succession, each claiming a part of the empire. The unity that Alexander had fought so hard to build unraveled almost instantly. Within years, the empire he had forged through blood and brilliance was divided into fragments: Macedonia, Egypt, and the Seleucid East, each ruled by one of his former commanders. The dream of a single, united world died with him. Yet death could not truly silence Alexander. His legend only grew, carried on the lips of poets, historians, and conquerors for centuries to come. To some, he was a hero, the embodiment of courage, intellect, and destiny. To others, he was a warning, a man consumed by his own ambition, who reached for godhood and lost himself in the process. But to all, he remained unforgettable. His name became synonymous with greatness itself, echoing through history like a challenge to every generation that followed. In the end, Alexander achieved what he had desired most: immortality. Not through temples or statues, not through cities or empires, but through the undying fascination of those who came after him. His story, like the empire he once ruled, was too vast to vanish. And perhaps that is the cruelest and most beautiful truth of his life, that in trying to become more than human, he succeeded, but at the cost of everything that made him one. Part 14: The Empire Without Its King. When the breath finally left Alexander's body, it was as if the heartbeat of the world itself paused. The man who had bent continents to his will now lay still, and for the first time in years, silence filled the halls of Babylon. Outside his chamber, his generals stood in disbelief, unable to accept that the figure they had followed from the burning plains of Persia to the mountains of India was gone. For a moment, the empire he had forged through brilliance, charisma, and sheer audacity hung suspended, an immense structure with no foundation, a storm without its eye. Then, slowly, the fractures began to appear. The question that Alexander's final words had left behind, "to the strongest," became a curse that would tear apart everything he had built. Alexander's death created a vacuum that no single man could fill. His empire stretched from the shores of Greece to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the deserts of Egypt to the rivers of India. It was a creation born of his personal genius, held together not by institutions or systems, but by loyalty to him alone. Without that central force, chaos was inevitable. The first signs of disintegration began in Babylon itself, where his generals, the Diadochi, as they came to be known, gathered to decide the fate of the empire. They were men who had marched beside Alexander for years, men who had fought and bled for his vision, but they were also men of ambition, pride, and suspicion. Each of them saw himself as the rightful heir to a portion of Alexander's glory. The immediate issue was one of succession. Alexander had left no clear heir. His half-brother, Aristeus, was mentally unfit to rule, and his wife Roxana was pregnant with a child whose fate was uncertain. In a hasty compromise, the generals agreed to proclaim both Aristeus, as Philip III, and Roxana's unborn child, eventually born as Alexander IV, as joint kings, with Perdiccas, one of Alexander's most trusted officers, acting as regent. It was a fragile arrangement built on political necessity rather than genuine unity, and it would not hold for long. Each of the great generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Cassander, began to carve out their own spheres of influence, all while swearing loyalty to a throne that existed more as an illusion than as a reality. The funeral of Alexander itself became a symbol of the power struggle that now consumed the empire. His body, preserved in a golden sarcophagus filled with honey, was meant to be transported to Macedonia, where he could be buried beside his father, Philip II. But along the way, the procession was intercepted by Ptolemy, the cunning general who had taken control of Egypt. Recognizing the symbolic power of possessing the body of a god-king, Ptolemy seized the coffin and brought it to Memphis, later moving it to Alexandria. There, Alexander's tomb would become one of the greatest shrines of the ancient world, a monument not just to the man himself, but to the empire's dismemberment. To hold the body of Alexander was to hold a piece of his divinity, and Ptolemy understood that better than anyone. Meanwhile, the uneasy alliance of the Diadochi soon collapsed into open warfare. The wars of the successors erupted, a brutal series of conflicts that would rage for decades, as former comrades turned into bitter enemies. The dream of unity dissolved in rivers of blood. Perdiccas tried to maintain control from Babylon, but his attempts to assert authority over men like Ptolemy only provoked rebellion. Within a few years, he was assassinated by his own officers. Antigonus rose as a formidable contender, ruling vast territories in Asia Minor, while Seleucus seized Babylon and would eventually build an empire of his own stretching from the Mediterranean to India. Cassander, ruthless and calculating, took control of Macedonia and Greece, eliminating rivals with cold precision. He ordered the execution of Roxana and Alexander's young son, extinguishing the royal bloodline and ensuring that no direct heir would ever reclaim the throne. As the wars dragged on, the ideal of a unified world, the dream that had once defined Alexander's mission, was replaced by a patchwork of competing kingdoms. Yet in their own way, the Diadochi carried forward fragments of his vision. In Egypt, Ptolemy established a dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, giving rise to a new era of Hellenistic culture. In the East, Seleucus founded cities that bore Greek architecture and language deep into Persia and beyond. The world Alexander had conquered did not return to what it was before him, instead, it transformed. His empire might have shattered politically, but culturally, it had become immortal. Greek thought, art, and philosophy began to flow like a river through the lands he had once ruled, merging with the traditions of the East to create something entirely new. The cities Alexander had founded, Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia, and dozens more, became beacons of knowledge and trade. In Alexandria, the great library rose, an institution that sought to gather all the wisdom of the world under one roof, echoing Alexander's dream of unity through knowledge. Merchants and scholars from across continents met in these cities, exchanging goods, languages, and ideas. Greek became the lingua franca of the known world, binding diverse peoples through a shared culture. Even in death, Alexander continued to shape civilizations that he had never lived to see. Yet, for all the grandeur of his legacy, the wars that followed his death were a tragic reminder of the empire's fragile foundation. His generals, who had once shared his glory, now died one by one in pursuit of their own ambitions. Antigonus fell in battle, struck down by the combined forces of his rivals. Seleucus, after years of triumph, was assassinated in his old age. Cassander's dynasty crumbled. Only Ptolemy's line endured, ruling Egypt for nearly 3 centuries until the time of Cleopatra. What had begun as one man's vision of divine conquest ended as a cycle of human greed and mortality. In Greece, the homeland that had once given birth to the conqueror, the people spoke of Alexander not as a king or a general, but as something larger, a legend that defied the limits of men. Poets sang of him as the son of Zeus, a hero who had walked the edge of the world. Philosophers debated whether his pursuit of glory had elevated or destroyed him. And across Asia, his image lived on in local myths, sometimes as a god, sometimes as a demon, but always as a figure of awe. The East remembered him differently than the West, yet both agreed on one thing: there had never been anyone like him. The empire without its king had become a mirror of Alexander's own contradictions, brilliant and chaotic, visionary and violent, timeless and fragile. His death had not ended his story, it had scattered it across continents, where fragments of his dream took root in countless forms. The Hellenistic world that emerged was both his legacy and his echo, proof that a single life, however brief, can alter the destiny of humanity. And yet, even in this fractured piece, there lingered an unspoken question: had Alexander truly conquered the world, or had the world conquered him? His empire was gone, but his idea had outlived every general, every kingdom, every war. The roads he built were still traveled, the cities he founded still thrived, and the stories of his deeds were still told in markets, temples, and royal courts from the Mediterranean to the industry. He had sought immortality, and in that, he had succeeded beyond measure, not as a god, but as a name that would never be forgotten. Part 15, The Eternal Shadow of a Mortal God. Centuries have passed since Alexander's body was laid to rest beneath the golden sun of Egypt, yet the world has never truly buried him. His empire may have shattered, his generals may have perished, and his bloodline may have vanished into the folds of history, but the idea of Alexander, the myth, the symbol, the dream, endures like a flame that refuses to die. Every civilization that followed would look upon his name and see not just a conqueror, but a question. How far can a human being go before he ceases to be human at all? In the centuries that followed his death, the story of Alexander spread like wildfire through lands he had once ruled and even beyond them. Greek historians, poets, and philosophers wrote of him with both awe and unease. To them, Alexander was the embodiment of arete, excellence taken to its ultimate extreme, but also a warning of what happens when ambition outgrows the mortal frame. In the East, the Persians called him Iskandar the Accursed for the devastation his armies had wrought, while others revered him as Iskandar the Great, a man chosen by destiny to reshape the world. In Egypt, he became a pharaoh; in India, a semi-divine figure whose arrival fulfilled ancient prophecies. Even centuries later, when empires rose and fell in the shadow of his memory, his name still echoed across languages and faiths: Sikandar, Iskandar, Alexandria, each one a reflection of the same blazing legend refracted through different worlds. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had sprouted from the ruins of his empire continued to carry his influence like blood through their veins. The art, architecture, and philosophy of Greece merged with the mysticism and traditions of the East, giving birth to a new civilization that would change the course of human history. The Library of Alexandria, founded in his name, became the beating heart of knowledge, a place where scholars from across continents gathered to study the heavens, the body, and the mind. The science of Aristotle mingled with the wisdom of Persia and the mathematics of Egypt. And though the world around it shifted and crumbled, the idea that one man's dream could bridge nations remained. Alexander's legacy was no longer confined to maps or monuments; it lived in thought, in language, in the way humanity began to see itself as part of something larger. Even Rome, centuries later, could not escape his shadow. When its generals marched eastward, they carried with them the writings of Greek historians who had chronicled Alexander's campaigns. Julius Caesar, when he stood before a statue of the Macedonian king, wept openly, lamenting that at his age Alexander had conquered the world while he had done so little. Pompey the Great, Antony, and even Augustus saw themselves as heirs to his vision, each trying to capture the same impossible glory. Rome would eventually become the empire that Alexander might have built had he lived, vast, multicultural, and bound by a single law, yet even at its height, Rome remained haunted by the ghost of the man who had first dreamed of ruling everything. No emperor, no matter how mighty, could escape comparison to the boy from Pella who had dared to call himself divine. As the centuries turned, the myth of Alexander transformed again. In the Middle Ages, his story became a tapestry of legend woven through countless cultures. The Alexander Romance, a wildly popular collection of tales, reimagined his life as one of divine adventure, a king who battled monsters, descended into the ocean, and flew into the heavens in a chariot drawn by griffins. In Islamic traditions, he became Tul-Karnain, the two-horned one, a ruler favored by God who journeyed to the ends of the earth to build a wall against the forces of chaos. To Christian monks, he was a tragic hero, brilliant yet flawed, punished for his pride. To Persian poets, he was both conqueror and philosopher, a seeker of wisdom who learned, too late, that no empire could satisfy the hunger of the soul. The real Alexander had died in Babylon, but the mythic Alexander, the eternal wanderer, lived on, endlessly reborn in the imagination of humanity. And yet, beneath the layers of legend, there remains the man himself, the restless spirit who burned so brightly that history itself had to make room for him. He was not a god, though he tried to become one. He was not a monster, though his ambition consumed countless lives. He was something in between, a mirror reflecting both the glory and the darkness of human desire. He proved that courage and cruelty, brilliance and madness, divinity and mortality, all existed within the same fragile heart. His victories were written in blood, but his vision was written in something far more enduring, the idea that greatness is not measured by what one conquers, but by what one imagines possible. When historians look back at Alexander's life, they often debate what drove him. Was it the dream of a unified world, or simply the addiction to conquest? Was he a visionary or a tyrant? The truth is that he was both, and that is what makes his story eternal. Because Alexander's journey is not just the tale of a king who ruled from the Adriatic to the Indus. It is the story of humanity itself, our boundless curiosity, our unrelenting hunger for more, and our inability to stop once we begin reaching for the infinite. His triumphs remind us of our potential, but his downfall reminds us of our limits. In his life, we see both the best and worst of ourselves. Today, the cities he built still stand. Alexandria continues to thrive, its streets layered with history upon history. The coins bearing his face are still unearthed from the soil of lands he once crossed. His name remains carved into stone, not as a relic, but as a whisper that the impossible can be done. Every empire that rose after him, Roman, Persian, Ottoman, British, carried traces of his vision, his arrogance, his brilliance. And in every age, there are those who look to the horizon, who dream of something greater, and in their ambition, they carry a spark of Alexander's fire. For though he died as a man, Alexander the Great achieved what he desired most, to become eternal. His empire may have vanished, but his shadow stretches still, cast across the centuries, a silent reminder that greatness always comes at a price. The boy from Macedonia conquered the known world, but in doing so, he became something no sword or empire could contain, a story without end.